A millionaire CEO insulted a janitor, and seconds later realized he'd just disrespected the wrong man. Most people who work downtown in St. Paul, Minnesota will tell you that mornings have their own rhythm, cars easing through intersections, coffee shops warming up their griddles, and office buildings flickering awake as the night crews finish their shifts. But that morning inside the Rowden and Pierce Tech Solutions building, it started with a moment that would change two men forever, even though neither of them saw it coming. Preston Rowden, the CEO, whose name sat on every polished glass door in the place, wasn't the kind of man who let small things slide. He believed in control, precision, and the loud reminder that he was the one running the show. He pulled up in his black sedan before sunrise, stepping out with that familiar confidence, chin high, coat sharp, steps quick like he was already behind schedule. Inside, the lobby lights cast a soft, pale glow across the marble floors, and right in the middle of that glow stood Darius Cole, pushing a mop across a small spill left behind by a late-night intern who didn't bother to clean up after himself. Darius didn't complain. He never did. He came to work, did his job, and kept to himself. A tall, quiet man in his early 40s, with tired eyes and a way of speaking that made people lean in because he rarely wasted breath. He'd been on the night shift for years, long enough to see managers come and go, long enough to learn which executives held a sense of superiority, like armor. Preston was one of them. "Morning, sir," Darius said, offering a polite nod, just trying to do his job. Preston didn't respond at first. He had that look he always carried when something inconvenienced him even slightly, his gaze locked on the mop, then on the wet floor sign, and finally on Darius, like all three were personally attacking his productivity. "Why is there still water on this floor?" Preston snapped. "People come through here in less than an hour. Does no one understand basic standards anymore?" Darius didn't flinch. He shifted the mop aside and answered calmly, "Just finishing up, Mr. Rowden. I'll have it dry before the day team arrives." Preston huffed, rolling his eyes. "I shouldn't have to step around this. Honestly, do you people not think ahead?" There it was, the tone everyone in the building recognized, sharp, cutting, and completely unnecessary. At that hour of the morning, two junior executives had come through the revolving doors just in time to catch the tail end of Preston's irritation. They exchanged awkward looks, pretending to check their emails to avoid the tension brewing in the room. Darius just kept working. But that's the thing about moments like this. Sometimes the person throwing the harsh words doesn't realize how loud they sound. Sometimes the person on the receiving end is carrying more history, more weight, more quiet strength than anyone expects. Darius had seen worse, much worse. This wasn't the first time someone talked down to him, and he doubted it would be the last. Still, there was something different about this morning. He just didn't know what yet. Preston adjusted his coat and muttered under his breath, "Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous." Then he stepped around the wet floor sign with exaggerated annoyance, like he had been personally wronged by a spill that took less than 3 minutes to clean. The two executives hurried behind him, whispering about the day's meetings, trying to ignore the uncomfortable sting still hanging in the air. Darius remained silent, dipping the mop into the bucket one more time. He'd grown used to moments like that. He'd learned not to let them stick to his skin. But something about the way Preston looked at him, something cold, dismissive, it hit a part of Darius he usually kept locked away. It was the same expression he'd seen on faces in places far from this polished lobby, in times when respect wasn't guaranteed and survival wasn't promised. And this morning, that old memory was beginning to stir. But what neither man realized was that the next few minutes would flip everything they thought they knew about each other. Preston didn't slow down as he moved deeper into the lobby. His shoes clicked sharply against the tile, a sound that always made people stand a little straighter when he walked by. But today, that sound carried something else. Irritation, pressure, and the kind of ego that didn't like being awake earlier than everyone else. The junior executives, Harlan Brooks and Stevie Moran, tried their best to match his pace. Harlan was younger, still carrying that nervous energy of someone afraid to disappoint the boss. Stevie, older and calmer, had learned how to let Preston's moods slide off him. But even he looked uncomfortable after the outburst in the lobby. "Sir," Stevie said carefully, "the board meeting is set for 10. Your presentation notes were finalized last night. We sent them over." Preston cut him off. "Yes, I saw them. Half of it felt rushed. Who reviewed the numbers for the second quarter projections?" "That was Alex in finance," Harlan said quickly. "He stayed late to..." I don't care how long he stayed, Preston snapped. I care about accuracy. Both men fell silent. They knew better than to push when his morning started like this. They followed him toward the elevators, their faces tight, like they were bracing for another strike of lightning. Behind them, Darius wrung out the mop and watched the trio disappear around the corner. He didn't take Preston's attitude personally. Not really. People who carried themselves like that often saw everyone else as tools, not humans. It was part of the job, and he'd learned long ago to keep his peace. But as he leaned down to wipe a streak he almost missed, something in his shoulder tugged. An old ache from another life, one he rarely talked about. One no one here knew anything about. He grunted quietly and eased the pressure, stretching his arm. The motion pulled his sleeve up just a bit, exposing the edge of a tattoo he kept covered at work. The ink had faded over the years, but the symbol was still recognizable to anyone who knew what it meant. Of course, the lobby was empty now. No one saw it. Not yet. He lowered his sleeve again. Upstairs, Preston reached the elevators, pressed the button, and tapped his foot with impatience. As they waited, he turned to Harlan and Stevie with a sharp stare. "Did either of you notice the mess downstairs?" he demanded. They exchanged quick glances. "It looked minor," Stevie said. "He was cleaning it up. It shouldn't have been there at all. I'm tired of people around here not respecting the standards I set." Harlan nodded too fast, trying to show agreement. "We can talk to the facilities supervisor." Preston lifted a hand. "Don't bother. I'm the one who has to walk through that lobby every morning. You'd think after all this time the night staff would figure it out. It's not difficult." The elevator doors slid open. Preston stepped inside first. Harlan and Stevie followed, staying quiet. As the elevator climbed, Preston caught his own reflection in the metallic surface. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharper than usual. He didn't notice the tension, or maybe he did and ignored it. He'd learned to push past discomfort rather than question it. "You know," he said suddenly, "the problem with this place is that too many people are comfortable being average." Stevie forced a laugh that didn't quite land. "You've always set high expectations." "I have to. If I don't, who will?" The elevator dinged for their floor. Preston stepped out briskly. But something small, nagged at him. A flicker in the back of his mind. He didn't slow down, but he felt it. A slight tug, like he had overlooked something important. He brushed it aside and marched toward his office. Back in the lobby, Darius finished the last pass of the mop and checked the clock. His shift was almost over. Most nights that meant he could head home without any trouble, but today he couldn't shake the feeling that the morning wasn't done with him yet. He loaded his cart and turned off the yellow sign. The building was waking up now. More lights, more voices, more movement. But Darius kept thinking about that moment when Preston barked at him like he was nothing more than equipment. He took a breath and reached for the elevator, but he didn't know that Preston was about to see something that would stop him cold. By the time Darius reached the elevator, more employees were streaming into the lobby. Suits, coffee cups, tote bags, hurried greetings. Another normal morning for everyone except the one man quietly pushing a cart toward the service corridor. He wasn't looking for attention. He never did, but people noticed him anyway, mostly because he made their jobs easier without them ever having to ask. And even though they saw him nearly every day, many of them never learned his name. Today would change that. As Darius maneuvered the cart toward the back area, his radio crackled with a message from the facility's supervisor, Gideon Tate. "Darius, I need you near the front desk. One of the security cameras might have a smudge on the lens. Check when you can." "On it," Darius replied. He turned the cart around and headed right back toward the same place where Preston had scolded him minutes earlier. The timing wasn't ideal, but he wasn't the type to argue. The front desk sat beneath a large set of hanging lights that made everything feel brighter than it needed to be. Two receptionists, Kiana Wells and Drew Hanley, were settling in for their shift. When they saw Darius walking back, Kiana gave him a small smile. "You're still here?" she asked. "Supervisor needs me to check the camera quick thing." "Always something," Drew muttered, typing on his keyboard. Darius nodded and pulled the small step stool from his cart. He climbed up to check the lens and wiped it gently with a microfiber cloth. Simple enough, no drama. But then the front doors opened again, hard this time, and Preston strode through like he owned not just the building, but the whole block. He must have realized he'd left something in his car, because his walk was rushed and sharp, Harlan and Stevie trailed behind him again, both still looking like they wanted to melt into the floor. Preston spotted Darius on the stool and immediately frowned. "You're still messing around out here?" Kiana's smile vanished. Drew stopped typing. Darius stayed calm. "Just doing one more task, sir." Preston stepped closer, making a show of looking annoyed in front of everyone. "If you'd handled everything right the first time, you wouldn't be wasting more time now." Kiana opened her mouth to speak, but caught herself. She wasn't about to get pulled into one of Preston's moments. Darius stepped down from the stool. "I did handle it. Supervisor asked for this one too." Preston scoffed. "Convenient excuse." Stevie shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, it's routine maintenance." "I didn't ask you," Preston said quickly. Harlan shrank into himself. Stevie clenched his jaw. Even Drew, who rarely reacted to anything, looked away. Darius stood tall, hands relaxed at his sides. "I'm just following the list I was given, that's all." "You know," Preston said loudly, making sure everyone nearby heard, "some people here act like this building owes them something. But it doesn't. You're here to do a job. If that's too difficult, maybe we need someone who actually understands responsibility." The words hit harder than they needed to. They echoed through the lobby, bouncing off shocked silence. Kiana shook her head just slightly, like she couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Darius didn't let the insult reach his expression. He simply turned back to his cart, steady and composed. But then it happened. As he reached for the step stool, his sleeve caught on the edge of the cart handle and slid back just an inch, maybe two. Enough. The tattoo, an angled black emblem with sharp lines and a symbol at the center, peeked out beneath the fabric Preston didn't notice at first. He was too focused on proving a point. But Kiana saw it. Her eyebrows lifted for half a second, recognition spreading across her face even though she said nothing. Then Stevie saw it. His eyes widened a bit, like he was trying to place it. Finally, too quickly to hide, Preston glanced down. His entire expression changed. His mouth parted just slightly. His eyes narrowed, not in anger this time, but in something close to disbelief. The color in his face shifted. He knew that symbol. He had seen it before, years ago, far from Minnesota. He blinked and stared harder, as if his eyes were trying to convince his brain that this wasn't possible. Stevie noticed the change. "Sir, you all right?" Preston didn't answer. His mind wasn't in the lobby anymore. Darius tugged his sleeve back down, unaware of the reaction he'd caused, but Preston couldn't look away. He couldn't move. Everything inside him had slammed to a halt. But the truth behind that tattoo was only the beginning, and Preston wasn't ready for what it meant. Preston didn't hear the lobby anymore. Not the footsteps, not the phones ringing at the front desk, not even Harlan whispering something that sounded like concern. All he could see, burned into his focus, was that mark on Darius's arm. That same sharp-lined emblem he'd only seen in one place. And that place wasn't Minnesota. It wasn't even the United States. "Sir?" Stevie repeated, a little louder this time. Preston blinked hard, like he was trying to snap himself back into the present. His thoughts scattered, collided, rearranged. For a moment, he didn't look like the man who walked around with absolute certainty in every step. He looked thrown off balance. He forced himself to speak. "I'm fine." But even he could hear how weak that sounded. Darius didn't seem to notice any of it. He was already pushing the cart toward the corridor, finishing up his shift. He moved with the same steady pace he carried every morning. No rush, no irritation, no awareness that he'd just shaken something buried deep in Preston's memory. Stevie watched Preston closely. "If you need to sit down, we can—" "I said I'm fine," Preston cut in, though the edge in his voice didn't land the way it usually did. It sounded thin, not empty, just missing the confidence that normally backed it up. Kiana glanced at Darius, then back at Preston. She didn't speak, but the look on her face said everything. Something had shifted. Preston took a slow step forward, eyes fixed on the hallway where Darius had disappeared. Harlan touched his shoulder lightly. "Sir, we have to get upstairs. The board's expecting—" "Give me a minute," Preston murmured. Stevie raised an eyebrow, surprised. Preston never delayed a meeting. Ever. Preston stepped away from the group and headed toward the hallway, moving slower than usual, like his body was trying to make sense of something his mind couldn't shake loose yet. He wasn't even sure what he planned to do. Ask Darius a question? Confront him? Demand an explanation? He didn't know. He only knew that the tattoo wasn't random. Not a design someone picked off a wall, not a trendy mark, not art. It belonged to a specific group, a group Preston owed more than he ever admitted out loud. He reached the corner. Just as Darius paused to adjust a trash bag on the cart, Darius turned when he heard footsteps. Their eyes met. "Something you need, Mr. Rowden?" Darius asked, tone simple and professional. Preston's mouth went dry. He studied the man in front of him, trying to measure what he didn't understand yet. "Your arm." Darius stiffened, just slightly. "What about it?" "The tattoo." "Where did you get it?" The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Most people would have answered quickly, proudly even, but Darius didn't. He lowered his gaze for a second, weighing the moment, then tugged his sleeve a little higher, exposing the emblem just enough. "You know what this is?" he asked quietly. Preston swallowed. "I've seen it, years ago." Darius nodded as if he'd been expecting that. "Not many people recognize it." Preston's voice sank to something low and uneven. "I do." A silence settled between them, thick, heavy, full of a past only one of them fully understood. Darius studied Preston's face. He saw something he hadn't seen earlier that morning: vulnerability. A crack in the armor, a memory pressing through. But before either man could say more, someone called from the lobby. "Mr. Rowden, the board wants to confirm your 10 o'clock. Preston blinked, dragged back to the present again. He took a step back. "I'll be upstairs shortly." Darius nodded once, still calm, still steady. "All right." Preston hesitated like he had another question, but wasn't ready to ask it. Instead, he turned and walked away, almost dazed. Stevie and Harlan met him halfway, both confused by the expression on his face. "You sure everything's all right?" Stevie asked. Preston forced himself to straighten up. "Yes, let's get moving." But his voice didn't match his stride, and his stride didn't match his eyes. Something inside him had shifted. You could see it in the tightness of his jaw, the slightly off rhythm in his steps, the way he kept glancing back at the hallway even when he tried not to. He was replaying old memories now, ones he had buried deep, memories of a night he never talked about, a night when the world went dark and he wasn't sure he'd survive, a night when men wearing that exact symbol pulled him from rubble and carried him towards safety. He had never seen their faces clearly. Everything had been smoke and chaos, but he remembered the symbol. He remembered the voices. He remembered one man giving orders, keeping everyone calm. He remembered strength, and now he was realizing that same strength had been sweeping the floors of his company for years. But Preston still didn't know the full story, and the truth waiting behind it was about to hit much harder. Preston made it upstairs, but the walk to his office felt longer than usual, like every step pulled him deeper into something he wasn't ready to face. The air on the executive floor was cooler, quieter, more controlled. Normally, the exact environment where he thrived. Yet today, even the calm didn't help. Stevie and Harlan followed behind, watching him closely. They traded glances, unsure if they should say something or keep their distance. Preston's shoulders were tense, his pace uneven, and neither of them had ever seen him look unsettled before. Inside the office, Preston shut the door harder than he meant to. The force rattled a picture frame on the wall. He walked straight to the window that overlooked the Mississippi River, hands pressed against the glass, eyes locked on nothing in particular. That tattoo, that symbol, it didn't belong to random chance. It belonged to a very specific memory he'd spent years avoiding. He replayed the scene in the lobby. Darius on the stool, sleeve slipping, that mark appearing like a sign he wasn't prepared to face. A knock on the door broke through the noise in his head. "Mr. Rowden?" Stevie's voice came from outside. "The prep meeting for the board is supposed to start." Preston inhaled deeply. "Give me a few minutes." "Understood," Stevie said. After the footsteps faded, Preston sat at his desk, elbows on the wood, fingers pressed to his temples. He didn't want to think about the past, but his mind was dragging him back anyway. He remembered dust, heat, screaming, the metallic taste of fear. He remembered being trapped under steel and concrete after the hotel collapse overseas. He had been there on business, trying to secure a deal that he thought would boost his company's future. Instead, the entire building had gone down after a structural failure. He'd been pinned, unable to move, barely able to breathe. And then, voices. Orders shouted with calm urgency, hands lifting debris. Someone saying, "We've got one breathing over here." Someone else answering, "Stay with me, we'll get you out." He remembered being hauled onto a stretcher. He remembered the emblem on the shoulder of the man who leaned over him, that same emblem on Darius's arm. Preston swallowed hard. He had never known the names of the men who saved him, didn't know which ones stayed by his side the longest, didn't ask, didn't bother. He was so focused on getting back to normal life that he pushed the entire event to the back of his mind. He'd always told himself he walked away from that collapse because he was strong, because he fought, because he refused to quit. But now, reality was pressing in. Someone else had fought far harder to pull him out. He stood abruptly and paced, the sound of his shoes softer on the office carpet than in the lobby. Every pass of the room made him more aware of a question he didn't want to ask himself. What had he just said to the man who might have saved his life? He pictured the scene again. His own words, sharp, cruel, loud enough for the lobby to hear. "You're here to do a job. If that's too difficult, maybe we need someone who actually understands responsibility." He winced, not physically, but the truth stung deep. His thoughts were interrupted again when the door opened without a knock this time. It was Gideon Tate, the facility's supervisor, a broad man with a calm presence who rarely needed help managing his staff. "Morning," Gideon said cautiously. "You asked for Darius?" Preston stiffened. "What? No." "You were looking for him in the lobby," Gideon said. "He thought maybe you needed something." Preston looked away quickly. "No, it's fine." Gideon nodded slowly, studying him. "He's heading out soon. End of his shift." Preston shook his head. "Tell him. Just tell him to wait a moment." Gideon raised his eyebrows. "Sure thing." Then he left the office, confused. Preston leaned back in his chair. The weight of everything pressed down on him. Ego, shame, memories, the truth he had ignored for too long. He rubbed his face with both hands. This wasn't something he could brush aside. This wasn't a moment he could overpower with confidence or coldness. This was a past debt staring him in the face, and the man he owed it to had just been sweeping the lobby while Preston lectured him like he was beneath him. He closed his eyes, replaying the voice from that night overseas, the voice that kept him awake when the rubble creaked. "Stay with me." His heartbeat thudded hard against his ribs. He needed to speak to Darius, not as a CEO, not as a man in charge, but as someone who finally understood his own ignorance. But Preston had no idea that Darius wasn't the only one carrying a memory of that night, and the revelation waiting for him was going to change everything. Gideon's footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Preston alone with a silence that felt heavier than anything he'd carried in years. He loosened his tie, even though it wasn't tight. The room felt smaller, the air warmer. He wasn't used to feeling this way, boxed in by his own thoughts. He went to the window again, watching a barge slide along the river far below. The movement pulled him back into a memory he'd spent more than a decade trying to ignore. He closed his eyes, and the office disappeared. He was back in Port Allen, Louisiana, where he'd stopped over before boarding the flight overseas. He remembered the airport, the thick air, the sharp smell of jet fuel. He remembered telling his assistant he'd be gone 2 days, maybe 3. He'd bragged about the deal he was going to secure, how it would put his company ahead of competitors for years. Everything had been about success back then. Numbers, growth, control. Then the memory jumped forward, fast and brutal. He was in the lobby of the hotel overseas. The noise was loud, people talking, phones ringing. He remembered checking his watch, annoyed the meeting was running late. He was halfway through an email when the floor trembled. Not like a small shake, like a violent jolt that ripped through the walls. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for help. Before Preston could move, the ceiling cracked open. A massive beam came crashing down. Debris exploded outward. The ground beneath him gave way, and he fell hard into darkness. His lungs filled with dust. His ears rang. For a moment he thought he was dead. Then he heard voices, footsteps on rubble, a man with a calm, steady tone. "Clear this section, we've got people under here." Another voice answered, "I'm on it." Preston tried to call out, but his throat wouldn't cooperate. A piece of metal pinned his leg, and every breath felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Then, through the haze, a flashlight beam cut across the broken space. "I've got one!" a voice shouted, closer this time. "He's wedged. Help me get this off him." Hands grabbed the metal grunts, straining. Then the weight lifted, and Preston sucked in a painful breath. A face leaned over him, but but everything was blurred. Dust, sweat, motion. The man wore a uniform with dirt smeared across the chest, and on his arm, clearer than anything else, the emblem. The same one Darius had. "Stay awake," the man ordered. "Tell me your name." Preston, he gasped. "Preston, listen to me," the man said. "We're getting you out." "Don't pass out on me." Another voice joined in. "We need to move. More shifts coming." "We're fine. I've got him," the man said firmly. "Preston, look at me." Preston remembered that voice, not its exact words, but the tone. Commanding yet gentle, strong but patient. The kind of voice that kept people calm when everything around them was falling apart. He remembered being hauled upward, every lift sending pain through his body. He remembered the moment the air cleared. The sun hit his face, noise from the street slammed into his ears. And then, more chaos. Questions, medics, sirens. He never saw the man again. Never got a name. Never said thank you. He pushed the whole event down so deep, he convinced himself he had simply survived because he was lucky and tough enough to make it through. Now he knew the truth. Someone else had carried him out. Someone who made choices under pressure that Preston had never even been close to. Facing. His eyes opened again. The office snapped back into focus. His heart pounded as though he'd lived the moment all over again. A knock sounded at the door. It was Gideon. "He's here," Gideon said. "Darius is waiting in the break room." Preston didn't turn around. "Thank you." "You need anything else?" "No." Gideon paused, studying his posture. "You sure?" "Yes," Preston said quickly. Gideon accepted the answer and walked away. Preston stared at the door long after it closed. He wasn't just embarrassed about the way he'd spoken to Darius. He was ashamed that he'd looked into the eyes of the man who rescued him and didn't even recognize him. Ashamed that he dismissed him like he was nothing. Ashamed that he built an empire on the belief that he alone carried himself out of every hard moment. He buttoned his jacket with shaking hands. He had to talk to Darius. He owed him more than words, though words were the only place he could start. He stepped toward the door, but he still didn't know that Darius had been carrying a memory of his own, one Preston wasn't prepared to face. Preston walked down the hallway with a stiffness he couldn't disguise. The carpeted corridor felt too quiet, like the whole floor was listening. When he reached the break room, he hesitated with his hand on the door handle. This wasn't a performance, not a meeting, not a negotiation. This was him confronting something he'd avoided for years. He exhaled slowly and pushed the door open. The room was mostly empty. Just a few tables, a humming refrigerator, a coffee machine that needed a cleaning cycle, and sitting at one of the tables, hands folded calmly, was Darius Cole. He looked up when Preston entered. No resentment, no glare, just a steady, tired expression from a man who had seen far more than most people in the building would ever understand. Preston cleared his throat. "Do you have a moment?" Darius nodded. "Sure." Preston closed the door behind him. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Preston stood across from him, struggling to find the right words that didn't feel forced, rehearsed, or shallow. Finally, he said, "I saw your tattoo." Darius's eyes lowered just slightly. "I figured you did." "You were there," Preston said quietly. "Port Allen collapse," Darius said, confirming it without hesitation. "I was part of the response team sent in to pull out survivors. You were one of the last we got out before another section caved in." Preston swallowed hard. I never knew your name." Darius shrugged, not in dismissal, but with the calm acceptance of someone used to being unseen. "Didn't expect you to. We weren't introduced. My job was to get you out alive." Preston sat across from him. The chair creaked under his tense posture. "I treated you with disrespect today," Preston said. "There's no excuse for it." Darius leaned back a little. "It's not the first time someone's talked to me that way. You're not the only one." "That doesn't make it right," Preston said quickly. Darius gave a small nod. "I know." Silence settled again. Not hostile, just heavy. Preston rubbed his hands together. "Why didn't you say anything? When I yelled at you, He stopped himself, unable to repeat the words he'd thrown at Darius earlier. Darius took a breath. "Because responding wouldn't have changed how you talked to me, and it wouldn't have made the lobby any calmer. I've dealt with worse attitudes from people who didn't even bother learning my name. Preston winced. Darius continued, voice steady. Besides, I don't tell people about the past. My work back then, it was just part of the job. After I got home, I didn't feel like being treated differently, so I kept my head down. Preston shook his head slowly. You shouldn't have to hide anything. Sometimes hiding keeps things simpler. Preston studied him. Did you recognize me earlier before I saw the tattoo? Darius paused, thinking, not at first. You look different now. No dust, no bandages, no panic. But once I saw your name on your badge years ago, I wondered. Preston frowned. You knew? Not for sure, Darius said. But it didn't matter. My job here isn't about the past. It's about earning a paycheck, just like everyone else. Preston leaned forward, Jesse. But it does matter. For the first time, something sharp flickered in Darius's eyes. Not anger, but a depth Preston hadn't seen before. You know what matters to me, Darius said. Respect, dignity, being treated like a human being. Most people don't give that to someone holding a mop, and that says more about them than it does about me. Preston felt the words like a strike to the chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing through the sting of truth. I owe you my life, he said quietly. And this morning, I treated you like nothing. Darius looked down at the table. Life's funny like that. Sometimes the people we ignore are the same ones we depend on without knowing it. Preston nodded slowly. If there's anything I can do to make this right, but Darius held up a hand. I'm not looking for favors. I'm not looking for special treatment. I don't want the spotlight. I just want to be treated like a man doing an honest job. Preston sat back, absorbing every word. I can do that, he said. You should do that, Darius corrected. For everyone, not just me. Preston nodded again, deeper this time, like he finally understood something that had been right in front of him for years. They sat in quiet for a moment longer. Then Darius said, You asked me why I didn't say something earlier. The truth? I figured you wouldn't listen. Preston's throat tightened. I'm listening now. Good, Darius said, standing, because this morning wasn't the first time you acted like the only person who mattered, but it can be the last. Preston didn't argue. He couldn't. Darius walked toward the door, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. He paused before opening it. You survived that collapse because a lot of people risked everything, he said. I wasn't the only one. Remember that the next time you talk down to somebody. Then he stepped out. The door clicked shut behind him. Preston stayed seated. He didn't feel powerful. He didn't feel in control. He felt human for the first time in a long while. But the real test wasn't talking to Darius. It was what Preston would decide to do next. Preston stayed in that break room long after Darius left. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant footsteps in the hallway, even the muted sound of phones ringing in nearby offices, none of it reached him. His mind was still replaying every second of the conversation, every truth Darius laid down, every mistake he'd glossed over for years. And for once, Preston didn't rush to escape the discomfort. He sat there and let it sink in. He thought about how easily he looked past people, how quickly he assumed he understood them, how fast he dismissed anyone he didn't see as important. It was a pattern that started long before this morning. It had shaped the way he built his company, the way he talked to employees, the way he moved through the world. And it took one man with a mop and a forgotten past to force him to look in the mirror. When Preston finally stood up, he felt different, like something heavy had been shaken loose. He stepped into the hallway just as Stevie turned the corner. There you are, Stevie said. The board's asking if you're running behind. I'll be there, Preston answered. His voice wasn't tense or sharp. It was calm, almost steady. Stevie blinked. Everything okay? Preston let out a slow breath. Not yet, but it will be. He headed toward the elevators, passing a handful of employees who gave their usual polite greetings. For the first time, he actually looked at them, not past them, not through them, at them. He reached the elevator and pressed the button. Before the doors opened, he spotted Gideon on the far end of the hallway. Gideon, Preston called out. The supervisor walked over, cautious but attentive. Yes, sir? I need to talk to your team later today, Preston said. All of them. I want to hear what they need, what isn't working, what I've been missing. Gideon raised his eyebrows. You sure? I am, Preston said. And also, thank you for sending Darius. Gideon gave a short nod. He's a good man. I know that now, so Preston replied quietly. The elevator arrived, and Preston stepped inside. As the doors closed, he saw his reflection again in the metallic surface. But this time, the man staring back at him didn't look untouchable or impatient. He looked like someone finally ready to change. Downstairs, Darius walked through the parking lot toward his old pickup. The sunrise was settling over the rooftops, painting the sky soft shades of orange and gold. He didn't smile, but there was something lighter in the way he moved, like he'd finally put down a weight he'd carried longer than he needed to. He opened the driver's side door and paused when he heard someone call out from behind him. "Darius!" He turned. It was Preston, out of breath from jogging across the lot. "I just wanted to say one more thing," Preston said, stopping a few feet away. "You already apologized," Darius replied. "I know," Preston said, "but I need you to hear this. You're not invisible in this place, not anymore. And you'll never be treated like you were this morning again, not by me, not by anyone." Darius listened quietly, hands in his pockets. "Then make sure you mean it." "I do," Preston said. They exchanged a simple nod, respectful, honest, and for the first time, mutual. Darius got into his truck and pulled away. Preston watched until the taillights disappeared. He wasn't proud of the man he'd been when the day started, but he was determined not to end it the same way. He checked his watch, straightened his jacket, and headed back inside, ready to face a boardroom with a clearer mind and a cleaner conscience than he'd had in years. Sometimes it takes a moment of truth to break a lifetime of bad habits. Sometimes the person we underestimate teaches us the lesson we didn't know we needed. Treat people like they matter, because they do. Every single one of them. If you want more stories with real emotion, real tension, and real lessons, remember to subscribe and stick around for the next one.